So, but that's gotten us through chapter 1 of The Hobbit. And so let's now go to any more questions, because that's basically as much as I wanted to get done today. But I've got another 20 some minutes if you've got questions for things I didn't cover. Thoughts, ideas? Obviously, I would love it if you all bought 20 copies of my books and gave them out to all your friends. I am not expecting you to buy a copy of my book to get value out of this class. I am demonstrating and hopefully collaborating on building models, because obviously I hope that this makes you excited about this to share with friends and to share the book with friends and so on. What I've got is a dilemma, because, okay, we all need to get paid. We all have reasons why we do things for pay. I would love to sell lots of copies of this book. I would also love to spread the ideas in the book. And until you start seeing examples of it in use, you might not see a value to the book. So this is why I wanted to do these sessions where I actually do modeling with real people, with your questions, with your feedback, and try to say, here's an example of how I use this. And if you want to see the notation in more detail, see some of the thoughts behind it, that's for the book. But here, I'm more about sharing with you, hopefully get you excited so you see some possibilities, so you want to do more of this and maybe start spreading word of mouth to friends about what this might do for you. For you who are plotters, there's, I think, a lot of value you're going to see. For you who are pantsers, it's, yeah, I can see that, but I already don't write outlines. Now I cannot draw pictures too. Well, as a confirmed plotter, I'm going to tell you, sometimes I draw the pictures because something's just not making sense in my head that already happened. So I'll go back and analyze my own work. Or sometimes I want to look at another story that somebody else wrote and understand the elements of it. So creating a model of it helps me think about it more deeply. Questions?
Tell us a little bit more about your book, the reasons you wrote it, what in particular, if you hadn't written it, how would you be using it? A lot of the ideas that you raised, I think we had the same mentor, Dave Wolverton, and his ideas for very intense plotting, sort of standing at odds with your approach of pantsing. How would you use your book if you hadn't written it?
How would I use my book? I really tried in the book to walk through an example of the steps you would go through in modeling a story. And so I like to think that I would diligently read every chapter and try it myself. But I also know that I can be flighty and short attention span, so I'd probably jump around to things that interest me, or look at a picture and say, I wonder what's going on there, and then read that section because I just know myself. This actually, if you're a member of Dave's Apex Writers Group, this started out as a session for FireCon conference. The second time I presented this was as 2 consecutive sessions for Dave's Apex Writers Group. So this material got a lot of honing there. Because I've been doing the software modeling, so that's my natural way of thinking. I've been doing the software modeling since 1997. And it is the way I think about problems, often in my head, even if I'm not putting them on paper. In my head, I am thinking, what would those shapes be like? As it happens, my book was almost entirely dictated, because I do most of my work dictation these days. And my company had a MULA. What does MULA stand for? Mandatory Unpaid Leave of Absence. As a cost-cutting measure, everybody in the company, the choices were, we're laying people off, or everybody takes 2 weeks off without pay and we don't have to lay anybody off. And the agreement was, we'll do the 2 weeks without pay. So I had 2 weeks with nothing to do, and my mom had passed away. I had no responsibilities at home. I did not yet have my feline overlords. They would come a month or two later. So I had no thing tying me down. So I got in my Jeep and drove up to Michigan's Upper Peninsula and drove around planning to work on dictating a story that I'd been working on. And halfway through the Upper Peninsula, I started getting the vision for this book. I always knew I wanted to make it into a book, but I started getting the vision for how I would do it. And so I started dictating this book while I drove. Anybody who's worried about me driving while dictating, it's just the way I do it. I know, but trust me, it's pretty safe. There are worse things I do in life. But obviously, while I'm driving, I'm not drawing pictures on paper or on the computer, but I was drawing them in my head and dictating what they should look like. So for me, as a very practiced person, yes, I can do these in my head. So if I need to solve a problem, I don't necessarily have to take it to paper. But the concepts of how to solve it were dictated over that time period to say, okay, here is an approach for teaching this, all these concepts that I want to get across. Here is an approach that I can do this. And then later on, as I tried to edit it into shape, I realized that I had parts 1 and 2 completely backwards. I was starting with the wrong one, and I was making the exact same mistakes in the new part 1 that I made when I started teaching software design. The exact same mistakes, which is I was trying to teach tools, not rules. I was trying to teach, here are all the pictures you can draw without the why, without a way of using these, not the way, tools, not rules. But if I didn't teach a way, no one saw a reason for the pictures. And so the way that I taught is a way I hope to go through next week in more detail, which is starting with characters, identifying their goals, identifying other characters involved in those goals, identifying their goals, identifying how those goals might play out, identifying conflicts between the characters because of conflicting goals, and slowly I am world building by accretion. Every time I look at a goal, I'm asking myself, why that goal? What's the motivation? What could go wrong during that goal? Who is going to be opposed to that goal? Who's going to be affected by it? Who will have to help? And so it becomes sort of I think of it sometimes as a sweeping process. And this is literally the way I design software too. I start with a single user, ask questions about what they need, ask questions about what we're going to do about that, ask questions about who is involved in that, ask questions about what they need. And by starting with that question of one person with one needs, I expand to define a whole system. And every piece of the definition is connected to some other piece or many pieces because they were discovered by asking questions about the pieces I knew. And that's sort of the process I try to teach in the book in part 1 is you're starting with a character and the character's goals. And we are driving through all of those to identify all sorts of elements of the world. And this would be essentially a similar concept to Dave's build the whole world and now start finding stories in it, except I'm building the whole world by starting with a character. Dave would often build the whole world by starting with a magic system or a culture or a religion or a political movement or something like that. And I think it's the last chapter of the book. I don't remember the chapters in my own book, but I have a chapter in there which is called Start Anywhere. Tools, not rules. There is no one right place to start as long as you start somewhere. And from that, learn new things and sometimes throw in things you haven't yet discovered. But I see it as starting in a place and discovering the things connected to the place and discovering connections to those, and by simply persisting at this, you build a whole world. And the reason why I have the Start Anywhere and part of that chapter is also an encouragement. And I have seen this forever in the programming world, especially trying to do designs. And I see it now in the writing world as well, but it took me a while to recognize it. People who don't start anywhere because they're afraid to start wrong. They are afraid that by starting in the wrong place, they're going to end up in the wrong place. They are going to end up wrong. And this is one advantage of models, is it's just lines on paper. If they're wrong, you erase them. You haven't committed to anything. This is fundamentally the difference between plotting and pantsing, is plotters on the whole are afraid of wasting time writing the wrong thing. Pantsers are not afraid to write the wrong thing. They just dive in and start doing it. And so plotters are trying to not waste time. They're trying to conserve their precious time. Pantsers are impatient. They want to discover what's the right story by writing it. Neither is wrong. It's a mentality. And I don't want to turn everybody into pantsers, but I do want to get people away from the concept of being afraid to start because I could start wrong. And when it comes to modeling, so what? It's wrong. You throw it away. How long did you really spend on the model? I think the longest I have ever spent on modeling a software system that a single person could write, because obviously huge systems that hundreds of people work on, that's a whole different world. But I think I one time spent 3 weeks on modeling a system that a programmer could sit down and write in the span of a few months. I spent about 3 days on that. 3 days is not a big investment, especially if along the way you discover, oh, wait, there's something horrible here. And this is much, much, much larger than we ever imagined. And by spending this 3 days up front, I save that time. That's the mentality that says the outline or the model will save us from being wrong. I consulted on one project where we sat down and spent a day modeling what they expected out of it, and no details because I don't know what the statute of limitations is on embarrassment. But when all was said and done, we'd realize with our model that the system couldn't be done. Not that the programming couldn't be written, but the real problem in the system that they were trying to fix was that users weren't following the rules to get jobs done that they needed to get done. And entering stuff into the program was more rules. And if they're already not following the simple rules, the idea that they're going to follow the more complicated rules just wasn't there. And there was a lot more behind that. But essentially, at the end of it, we realized this problem can't be solved by writing software. This problem can only be solved by hiring more disciplined, diligent, conscientious people, which means probably paying them more money. And the management is never going to do that. So all that's going to happen to the software team here is they're going to spend 15 months writing a system that does everything they were told to do and doesn't work, and the customer isn't going to pay them for it. And I don't know about you, but I can't afford to spend 15 months to not get paid. That's the mentality that says a plot will save you from wasting lots of time. And I'm hoping that I will show you a way to do lots of plotting and modeling to weave through the choices quickly to end up with ones you're really happy with. I think I probably just wandered about 300 miles from your original question, but did I get an answer in there somewhere?
Oh, yes.
Okay. So, yeah, one of my saddest regrets is I didn't finish this book in time for Dave to see it because he was very excited about it. He really thought that I had in part 2, I've taken a lot of what he taught with Farrell's triangle and with trifail cycles and so on, and I built on that and combined it with ideas from Vonnegut and combined it with my own ideas and others to end up with a real refinement on his teaching. And he was so excited to see that in Apex, and I wanted to get this book out, and then life took turns for me, and then we lost him. So
I think many of us share a similar regret, or a regret of a similar nature.
yeah.
And similarly to Dave, I'm very excited to see what you came up with.
I'm appreciating that. Obviously, I hope everybody gets the book and loves it. But I felt like you need to see me do it to really appreciate what's in the book. Text is so static.
I like your comment about start anywhere. A lot of the stuff that I'm working on right now is I have these transitional circumstances. I'm effectively starting from the middle of the book.
Mm-hmm.
And what I end up with at the middle is a short story that reads a great deal like THX 1138. You have a character you don't really care very much about who escapes from a bad thing, and that's the end. And it's a terrible story, but it's a great middle.
Mm-hmm.
Now I have to make the characters into people you care about, and then I have to show the circumstances and the results of that at the end. But I start out with this, what looks like rubbish in the middle, and I can see where I could use this modeling technique, particularly to flesh out the beginning part.
Mm-hmm. How did he get here? What were the goals of the people that landed him here? What were the stakes they were arguing over, and so on? It's absolutely a start anywhere sort of thing, and a throw it away when you're done if it's not quite right, but it got you going. For those of you who remember your high school physics, I have a metaphor for these sorts of things. I also use the same metaphor when it comes to writing prompts. If you remember from your high school physics, it takes more force to start a block moving across the plane than to keep it moving. The difference between starting friction and sliding friction. Metaphorically, that's what many of these techniques are: writing prompts, models, and so on. They're to get your brain moving. If your brain goes moving and accomplishes something, and it has nothing to do with that initial force that got you started, you still finish something. It can be very hard to get moving compared to keeping moving. In diabetes class, they taught us, I don't know if there's science behind this, so consider it a rule of thumb, except of course we don't have rules, we only have tools, so call it a tool of thumb. The tool of thumb is it takes roughly 21 days to establish a good habit. Round up, call it a month. It takes 6 days to lose a good habit. 6 days of skipping and you're starting over. I don't know if there's science behind it, but boy, that feels like how my life goes. That once I've got that month of doing it, I can keep it up. If I spend a week not doing it, I'm going to spend months not doing it. So I would rather do anything to get me moving, even if the thing getting me moving turns out not to be what I finish with. If a model gets you ideas and gets you going, and you eventually go somewhere else, you still went somewhere. All right, any more questions? Then I want to thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Am I still screen sharing?
Yes. You
Yes.
are.
Yeah.
Thank you, Martin. I really appreciate it.
I am going to attempt, schedule permitting, to do this more times. Next week, I would like to do the opposite of analysis. Next week, I want to start with a character and goals and find a story. And we won't know what the story is because it won't happen until we get there.